today, my idea is to pick up sort of exactly where we left off last week, because I forgot to say some very important things about some of those sculptures that we were looking at. What we were looking at a history of artists who worked in media forms, from video all the way up to surveillance, moving the video image away from a single screen into multiple screens, moving the video image into new technologies, into bigger and bigger and bigger scale, bringing in relationships of the physical body in the image, in the case of Gary Hill, and in the case of Julia Scher, actually looking at the fusion of video technology in surveillance hardware and the idea that she needs to reveal the whole operation of surveillance technologies so that we understand our place in them and ask the question, what are they looking for? What do they want to know? What is its function? And I forgot to say one of the most important things about the works that we were looking at is that one thing that the artists all have in common is there was this great effort to break away from what artists saw as the tyranny of the frame, the single frame, the adoption of other practices in the visual art that were sort of structural, painting, photography, and bringing those, and film particularly, and bringing that into the video image. But the artists were of such a revolutionary nature and had such a calling in media, working with time, illumination, but also, what did I talk about, the three aspects of them that were fundamentally important in the work was the fact that they were technical, the fact that they were structural, and the fact that they were philosophical, and each of those concerns came together in the works that we were looking at. And today, we're going to take a little departure from that and go into moving image media. On YouTube, of all places, you can almost find anything in YouTube. Look at some other artistic practices of getting away from the frame, breaking out of the frame of media, breaking into a larger framework of concerns, and then go from that we're going to break into museums and art organizations. We're sort of going to take a look at, we're going to break them apart, we're going to kind of look at some of the foundational programs invented by artists that led to the creation of museums and contemporary art spaces and arts organizations that we know today. Sort of look at what we have in Maine, sort of look at what we might need in Maine. We're going to break them open a little bit, but we're going to look at their birthmarks, and then I'll end by telling a story about how I actually had to break out of a museum once. I, as a living person, was trapped inside a museum, and I had to get out. Which is, of course, the stuff of comedy, situation comedy, and stuff like this, but when it happens, it's not so funny. So, in artists' interest in like Julia Scher exposing the apparatus of surveillance, or in Anthony Pake's case, developing the language of television so that he had control of the electronic image and actually inventing synthesizers and machinery to actually control and animate the image as he saw fit in media. I'm going to start today with an installation by two artists, Kit Galloway and Sherry Rabinovitz, who in 1980 created a piece called Hole in Space. And Hole in Space preceded pretty much everything we know today. In 1980, there were no cell phones. In 1980, we knew about satellites. We knew about satellite media, because that had been, the principle of satellite communication was introduced after the Kennedy assassination by Lyndon Johnson when he spoke, President Lyndon Johnson, when he spoke to Queen Elizabeth for the first time via telephone communication for a satellite. The first model for a satellite, incidentally, was the moon, and there still exists some like World War II technology over in Northern Europe that actually still communicates with the moon, still bouncing signals to the moon. There's an artist in Scotland who found them, and she's actually writing music and sending the music to the moon, and then the moon is sending the music back, and she's discovered that it's full of all these spaces and all these sort of inconsistencies that she didn't write in the music, but it's coming back like technically and temporally altered somewhat from how she sent it up. that's just nuts, but I really love it. And she's showing that work for the first time next year in Sydney, Australia, in a show called Marking Time. Put it on your calendars, buy your ticket now. It's going to open March 2012. The piece I'm showing today also has to do with satellites. In 1980, the artists set up a camera and a transmission station in New York, and a camera and a transmission station across the country in Los Angeles. And what you're about to see, if everything works out, how are things looking?
Should.
Things are looking good?
Just hit the space bar and it came up.
Okay, here's something good, okay.
In 1980, artists Kit Galloway and Sherry Rabinowitz placed life-size video displays at the Century City Mall in Los Angeles and Lincoln Center in New York. They connected them using a satellite link, sculpting a hole in space. At first, passers-by were unsure what was happening.
Talking to? Are they actors? They look like young people in a show.
They're just people like you and me.
My God, it looks like chorus line having a little lunch break.
They just walk by someplace and like they're just talking. They saw this side. How did you get here?
They're probably...
Just walked. Do we know what's going on? Do you know what's going on?
No, not really.
They're in New York.
They're in New York? I'm in Los Angeles, right?
Are you?
Yes.
Galloway and Rabinowitz showed that rich human communication was possible over a high-speed link. They showed that size and bandwidth do matter.
I said, where you going?
Where am I going? I'm standing right here with you.
Oh, I like that, baby. I like that. I like that. Oh, yeah, girl. Oh, yeah, we gotta get together sometime. Say what, baby?
Really, don't let me catch your side, but really.
Hey, girl, if I come now, look for you personally, baby.
I got your number, huh?
I hope you do, girl. No, promise.
The experiment ran for 2 hours on 3 successive days. TV coverage after the second day led to plan meetings, and they saw that size and bandwidth communicate emotion.
At Lincoln Center, I'm going to have the story tonight of interactive art, satellite sculpture, East Coast meets West Coast via live TV. Tell your friends. It'll be up again tomorrow night. Century City in Los Angeles, Lincoln Center here in New York. New York time will be 8 to 10 p.m. at Lincoln Center. All right? Thank you, Peter. Bruce, I can see you. Can you see me? What's the weather? Are you ready to go? The weather isn't bad. We'll wait a while. See you. In
But who can afford the 15 to 45 megabits per second bandwidth to convey such emotion? We're beginning to see high-speed telepresence in corporate boardrooms in the United States, and also in ordinary homes and apartments in Korea, Japan, France, and other nations. The U.S. is rapidly falling behind other nations in internet connectivity. This will dampen creativity, hurt the economy, and reduce the quality of our lives. Do we want a few holes in space or a few million? We have a new Congress now, And in 2 years, we'll have a new Federal Communication Commission. Things can be changed. To learn more, listen to this speech by FCC Commissioner Michael J. Cobbs. Or watch Bill Moyer's PBS special on the net at risk. To get angry, read Bruce Kushnick's expose of the U.S. phone company's $200 billion in broken promises. And ask yourself, what if ExxonMobil owned all the highways? Or what if there were holes in space between Israel and Gaza?
Okay. Let's see how, oh, excellent. This is all going to work out. Now, that's sort of a very old document of that groundbreaking piece that Kit and Sherry made so many years ago. And they came out of all the artist collectives in the 70s and later in the 1980s, like Paper Tiger Television and all groups of artists like Top Value Television, TV that did just remarkable things, like and the unauthorized documentary of the Republican Convention, I think in 1973, was that, whenever that was, in Chicago. But it was amazing, creative activist projects, creating another voice and envisioning a possibility for mass communication media, and how data, how the collection of data can become such a vital form of documentary, portraiture, time-based art and things. And you saw in Hole in Space, when it was up for 3 days, you saw some of the images when it was up for 3 days, because people started actually to use it. As the woman who saw her mother, you know, people started to meet in front of it and have conversations across the country. This was it's a time with our 4S Apple iPhones that it's very hard for us to imagine that a time existed before all this. But artists have envisioned these possibilities in media for the longest time, making the most exquisite history of experimentations that then led to greater and greater and greater application in the industry, in our communication tools. The next artist I'm going to show is another that we took a look at last week. Jim Campbell, you'll remember him. The field of LEDs were right there at the edge of perception, so that you actually saw images because he transferred film to data circuits. And I did mention that Jim last week, I did mention that he holds a number of patents actually in Silicon Valley, working for different companies, working for different countries as well, engineering communication devices, the operation of communication
In
devices.
1980, artists Kit Galloway and Sherry Rabinowitz.
No. You have to stop. And then I have to pull down Jim Campbell. This will be silent. And I should say, too, that if you remember the moving image pieces of Nam June Paik, 4 years after Sherry and Kit did this piece for Satellite, Nam June Paik organized for the 1984 New Year's Eve celebration a project called Good Morning George Orwell. And he linked together, it's a great moment, he linked together all of the television stations around the globe that had artist residencies and experimental television programs, like WNET in New York, GBH in Boston, KQED in San Francisco, Channel 4 in England, ZKM in Germany, and staged performances, events, what used to be known as happenings in Nam June Paik's day. And for the full New Year's Day, as it hit midnight in all the locations around the earth, there was an ongoing celebration of projects. It's quite an extraordinary thing. And now, speaking of data, how is it that artists can so beautifully translate data into projects? This is a project by Jim Campbell called Exploded Light. It started maybe 10 years ago, and he's still working on it, still composing these. And remember the very fixed matrix of LEDs in his earlier work, this is a freestanding construction of independently suspended light bulbs. Only they're not real light bulbs. He took the light bulbs apart and he put white LED units into the light bulbs and then put them back together again. So they look like 19th century, or rather 20th century light bulbs, only they're outfitted with LEDs. So they hang as just dots in space. But when you look up into it, of course, what you see is a film that he shot long, long ago in India of birds. But the reason, isn't that beautiful? The reason you see the birds, of course, is that the lights are set up against a dark background, a black painted background. And they're either on or off. And the illumination changes according to the digital program. It's quite a lovely piece. And a version of it is being installed right now in San Francisco. I think it's even opening tonight at the museum. I got an email inviting me to dinner, but I thought it was a long trip after work here today to go there. But I did want to see how it would look in such a large scaled environment. But he is truly now moving away from the flat plane, the tradition of painting, and even in the tradition of cinema, and he is coming, boldly into a three-dimensional space. I think last week, or whenever it was, I was speaking here, I talked a little bit about Nam June Paik's relationship to there's so much on the internet that I didn't even know how it gets in there. Who puts these things in there? Because this is a film by one of the, I should say, leaders of a movement that found itself at home in New York. George Machinius, a Hungarian immigrant to New York. I'm sorry to say that I'm showing one of his films out of order. This is the second one that I wanted to show. Did you see what that was? Well, we'll watch it. We'll watch it. We'll watch the one I wanted to show first. How's that? I think
There's that email.
this is
too
it.
below.
Yes, this is it.
Okay.
This is a film. You've seen the other one, and so this is a film that Machunius made, again, just out of data. Yes. This is something called 1,000 frames. And it's exactly what it is. Now, you remember I showed the work of Tatsuo Miyajima, which was the counter line, the artist that took all of those LED counters out of machinery and got his hands on hundreds and thousands of them that were set into a line and all counted at different speeds and at different time sequences and intervals. There were send, there were receipts, this major landscape of time and of counting. This film by Machunius in 1960 is exactly what the title says. 1,000 frames. That was it. That's the length of 1,000 frames going through a film projector. And the earlier one that we took a look at if you remember that one, that's had criteria, which was the length of the film, the length of the film itself. Want to watch it again? Or do you remember seeing it? Remember it said 10 feet, 5 feet, that sort of thing. It was the number and the configuration of exactly the material that you were looking at going through the frame. And here's another flux film by Paul Sheretz, also a Fluxus artist. Which is rephotographing of a 1907 or 1902, whatever it's in the Sears catalog. I mentioned this to one of the students today, that for Fluxus, archaic instruments and archaic machines and even archaic forms of print media and font was very, very, very important to them, because they often drew from it to create their own contemporary art pieces. And Fluxus is actually one of the legs of sort of a three-legged stool that are terrific starting points for a discussion about our art museums and the history of our contemporary arts organizations, as starting from some really significant points of experimentation and departure by visual artists. And the one thing that these stools have in these legs of a stool have in common is that they were sort of the genesis of new thinking and reimagining art. Because Fluxus, of course, that basically one of their fundamental purposes was to look at art as an institution and figure out what can be done to break art away from commercialism, from commodities. This is still more flux film. And to create, a series of artworks that had to do with community, that had to do with probably anything that moved the artwork away from the primacy of vision as the dominant sense perceptor in an artwork. Fluxus moved things along to look at the body itself as an instrument in art-making practices. There's a famous piece, scroll piece, Neandra Peck actually kept dipping his necktie into a pot of paint and making a line on the floor with it. The Fluxus artists came from all over the world, and they found themselves all working in Lower Manhattan. And almost all the freedoms that we enjoy today as visual artists, as disciplines, as equal to sort of the primacy of vision, movement, illumination, earthworks. There's this absolutely beautiful poster that Fluxus made inviting people to help clean up the streets. And it's a photograph of the cobblestone, a top-down photograph of cobblestones in New York. Only the letters of the invitation are all around like garbage and litter that have to be swept up into the right order in order to read it. So each one of the graphics becomes a puzzle that has to be put together so that you understand what they're asking you to come and do. And basically it's to clean up garbage from their neighborhood. That neighborhood was also always full of, some of you probably won't remember these, but adding machines. Oh, when you get your receipt from your grocery store, that used to be garbage all over Manhattan. Those strips of numbers of things that people bought, just like your groceries. Well, the Fluxus people decided that all numbers and sequences should be translated into a musical score, and so so that sales receipts could be performed as music, as in a chorus. These are the types of things that Fluxus did. To finish a thought that I let drop, the freedoms that we enjoy today are actually suffered by a lot of the Fluxus artists in around 1965 to about 1970 because nudity was illegal, different types of performances and different kinds of burlesque and different kinds of their activities were seen as being unlawful. And it moved from Fluxus into something like the Living Theater that was doing, they did that piece called Paradise Now in New York, and that it fuses with rock and roll. Fluxus went to court over and over and over again, and those artists systematically won their trials, that we had the right to be naked, that our bodies could be used as an instrument in art making, that things could be done. And that time after time, there's this history of trials, and they win over and over again, and it's really quite spectacular. The other stools of my this principle about artists creating new opportunities or new programs in the early part of the century that then morph into the institutions that we know today are actually pretty simple to work back and to think about these events that happened earlier in the century. Specifically, the Armory Show of 1913, which everyone knows about, in an abandoned military, what was it, the 63rd Artillery Armory in New York, was the site of an exhibition of avant-garde and European works for the first time in America. The artists that put it together are kind of extraordinary in themselves. They're Walter Kuhn, Arthur B. Davies, and the ash can of the realist painter John Sloan. And Walter Kuhn was a sort of a sculptor of sort of a socialist, labor progressive mold. You don't see too many of his sculptures, but every now and then you'll go to a museum and you'll see one of these absolutely fantastically rendered figures of somebody that's burdened by work. It's just, there's a dialogue in his sculptures that are so nice about sort of the pursuit of freedom, but the oppression of work and of labor, and they're really quite lovely. And in the book that was published on the occasion of the 1913 Armory Show, Walter Kuhn wrote a fantastic essay, and its title is "To the Artist of the Future." And basically, the content of his essay is: don't accept anything as given. Create your own institutions that will be a reflection of a mirror of your interests. Arthur B. Davies, of course, was a visual artist. He ended his life sort of as a mystical painter out in California, out on Mount Tamalpais. But in his day, he was closely aligned with all of the visionary choreographers of the time, and he had this really great theory. If you find any of his artworks, and incidentally, you'll find them. Oh, they're strange. He painted unicorns and ballerinas and groups of people and visionary landscapes. And Arthur B. Davies is maybe one of my favorite eccentric American artists, but he had this fantastic theory about representation, is that in order to depict the vitality and the excitement and the presence of a figure, you had to always depict the figure in what he called fully inflated. Everybody had to be full of air, very excited. And when you find his pictures, they're just spectacular. But again, it's not like he ends his life making circus paintings, but he does end his life making these kind of visionary landscape pictures of the mist and the light of the West Coast. But together, these artists brought to America something that the press understood as the attack of the avant-garde on America. The President of the United States went, right? Theodore Roosevelt went. Saw Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, and he referred to it as the naked man on the stairs. The painting was there by Marcel Duchamp. You know the Cubist painting, the rendering of the figure in sort of 3 dimensions from one perspective, which is like the key to Cubism, is that it's a flat picture, yes, but the artist would collect the graphic data of the artwork by walking around it and sort of rendering it in 2 dimensions as a 3-dimensional experience. So the nude descending a staircase struck a nerve, actually, with the press and with the people of America. And the show wasn't up but a few days before a cartoonist for the New York Times published something called Rude Descending a Staircase. And it was the masses and the crowds and everything in going down into the subway station, all rendered as a cubist painting. So here he struck a nerve because the artist and the Armory show touched on the experiences that all Americans were having in conversation with the advance of mechanization, with communication media. And this is in 1913. This is a year before World War I. And also on this leg of the stool is the European movement that comes right after World War I. So I guess the leg of my stool is between post-war, pre-war and post-war. That the Dada movement, which comes after World War I, after the shattering of borders and boundaries in Europe, there are artists from all countries who belong to no single country, but they have ideas. They have ideas about what constitutes a work of art after something so violent as World War I, where I mentioned this morning, this is the first time that people saw aerial bombardments, weapons, the destruction of their cities, the shifting of borders all over Europe. You might have thought you were from one country, but after the war you were from quite another. So all of these artists gathered in places like Zurich, where Hugo Ball ran the Café Voltaire, something we think of today as a performance art venue like the Kitchen. Hugo Ball actually said, art is not the end, but a means to create a perception of the times we live in. That was sort of his whole guiding principle, and everyone in Dada who collected in various cities of Europe, coming from no nation of origin, using materials that were spare and sparse. And we think of Dada as being, it's not so much a form as it is a collection of relations, or you've seen the work. It's the era of montage, of collage, of fragments of collected material all put together to evoke sort of a map of mental space, or to create a new language from the fragments, from the horror, sort of from the mess. And it's really the birthmarks of montage and collage media that we look at. They work with everything: photography, drawing, printed inks, just phenomenal work by a group of people, as I say, assembled around art, not around a nation of origin. And the other wonderful leg to sort of a stool for the analysis of our museums, and I've taught independent curating before, I've taught sort of museum studies before, and if you follow these lines of history down, it does go to these moments of artists' invention that lead up to the making of museums and the making of organizations. The other, of course, is the Venice Biennale that starts late in Venice, that starts late in the 1800s as a sort of a design and furniture showroom, basically. But by 1907, through methods and various means, it starts to become the place where new art from around the world is actually seen. And I think it was in the 20s, actually, that the Venice Biennale started to build the pavilions, the national pavilions for the exhibition of artists' work from various countries. In 1930, it was kind of seized by Italy for propaganda, but then when it reopened again around World War II, the Venice Biennale was the site of sort of the introductions of all the great movements, you know, like abstract expressionism and you know, surrealism before it. And it was the site where it seemed like art movements were introduced. But fundamentally important to the Venice Biennale was the first group of organizers, mostly artists, some politicians, but mostly artists, that the very ground that on which the Venice Biennale pavilions sit was legislated so that it was free of any influence by the church or by the state. Because they knew the Vatican, of course, was in Italy, so they would have control over content, or they would have say over content, or they would have great power to wield against artistic content that they found was questionable. The government would also be sort of nervous about certain forms of expression, but the very land that it sits on is actually free of those influences, which is sort of extraordinary when you think of it, and why it's sort of such an important festival, you know, to this day. It's sort of autonomous. It has its own laws, and the laws that it has were sort of determined by the groups of artists that really put it together, which is so fantastic. And you know, right around 1920, 1940, there was a group of artists, again in America, that were called Society II.mov was their name. They thought it said Anonymous Society, but, the artists in it, Marcel Duchamp, Catherine Dreyer, and Man Ray. But Man Ray didn't know his French so well, I guess. And he thought that it stood for an anonymous or an autonomous society, like in the Venice Biennale, that the Society of Artists could live exempt of these kind of social rules or the kind of the rules of the Academy. But actually, it turns out that more closely translated in French, it actually means Corporation Incorporated. But the Society II.mov in New York started to guide modernism forward, ideas in modernism, mostly architecture, mostly music at first, but they started having exhibitions in a townhouse. They were active for maybe 20 years, but when they started to dissolve from some creative differences and some turmoil about where the institution was going to go, the founding trustees of the Museum of Modern Art sort of picked up the continuity of what the Society II.mov was doing, and they sort of forged from that program the guidelines which were going to steer the Museum of Modern Art. So what was it? The Museum of Modern Art opened, what, in 1929, I think? I can't see my notes anymore, so I'm winging it. Yes, the Museum of Modern Art opened in a townhouse following the Society II.mov, the way they understood modernism, or like the canon of modernism. And so they opened the Museum of Modern Art in 1929. 2 days later, the stock market closes, and of course, it's the Great Depression. But but this group of people actually build the Museum of Modern Art, and 10 years later, they open up to the public this collection of modern paintings and pictures. So, I don't have any, wait, I have to think about what I have. I have to think about what my next, I have to think for a moment. Well, just like last week, I'm going down. Time for some applesauce.
Bob, that email you sent me with the order is just right, we pulled up, it's just right.
Oh, no, I only have one more, I actually only have one more thing to show. But in the organization of our museums, or what I say is breaking into museums a little bit, following sort of their histories all the way back, you do have these points of departure. I mean, not in terms of something like the Universal Museum, which is something like the British Museum, where if you're ever in London, it just sets you back dizzy, because the British Museum starts from one person's collection, but what it does is it reflects empire. It really reflects of its time. It started, 1763, and it has been growing and growing and growing ever since. And what it shows is the growth and the expansion of the British Empire and the countries conquered, and the artworks and the things of absolute beauty that were collected from the world as their empire expanded in this building in Kensington. So you walk in there at the Universal Museum, you see sort of everything. And as you know from a lot of museums now, there's repatriation all the time, where goods have come into museum through suspicious channels, and you will be reading this for the rest of our lives, that museums through litigation have to give things back, have to give things back to Iran, have to give things back to Turkey, because there's no provenance, there's no knowledge of how things came into the museums. So, like the British Museum, the chances that they were stolen is really pretty high, really. So you have that kind of museum history. So the universal museums aren't necessarily museums of great interest in terms of this talk, but the museums that are the modern museums that are in all of our cities, you could say that those museums follow the tradition to interpret, to contain, to collect, to provide what the Venice Biennale actually did in terms of identifying movements and putting art in their collection according to sort of safely consumable packets. We used to have a joke at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art that doesn't exactly follow the same modern canon as the museum in New York, but we used to often refer to it as the Modernist Project. And by putting things up for visitor for the visitor experience, we used to fight so hard against the behold and move along installation, of great modernist works of art. It's like, here's your Rothko, here's your Pollock, behold and move along. We did try to put things in galleries and in places so that you could really see what the artist achieved, other than the work of art as a value, as a commodity, or as a commercial value to selling the museum experience to people. In our contemporary art centers, there's a whole other different project. The contemporary art centers that kind of come up out of Fluxus because they were making works of art that didn't fit into the old canon. So new institutions were made for experimental installations, to guide sort of the contemporary spirit together, free of too many classifying standards and practices. And so you could say that the contemporary museums actually, they analyze, they investigate, they present. It's a place for contemporary artists to work. And then what we have now, as a result of something like the Dada movement that comes out of the Armory show, is we have the experimental, arts organizations. The spaces, the whole purpose of the most experimental art organizations is to create space. And in creating the space, they create room for experimentation. Perhaps the best value that artists can have is the value to experiment and the right to fail. Because, we said this even, the class is sitting here. We said that even, if you're not, you're not working hard enough if you're not failing in something. And then I think about, the times in which we are now living, knowing that the arts organizations that started at the time of wartime, a lot of historians, philosophers will say that the conditions of war created incredible stage for new ideas to emerge. Is that the artistic struggle is sometimes as great inside an individual as the cultural struggle is in actual, artillerized and weapons war. Is that there's a mental condition that makes it so that you probably know this as art students, so that we're fighting with ourselves as much as the terms of conflict are also around the world. What is the best medium? How do I translate my experience into a form language or into a visual form? What does give, useful shape to the art of our times when our time is so disjunctive, and gosh, we have all this communication media, we have all this turmoil, we have all these issues, and one of the biggest issues to ask is what kind of institution is there that can recognize this and support this condition so that we have a place, a place that artists can create and call our own that really doesn't exist. I'm new to Portland, and so I know that we have the Portland Museum of Art, which is of course one of the centers that collects, interprets, analyzes for your consumption through the visitor experience what it's like to go to a museum. We have that. That's there. We have something like Space as an alternative gallery because, well, there's space is space, but when you go into Space, things are sort of very well commodified. It's connected to, music, much the same way Fluxus is connected to music and new artistic enterprises, in a way. We have the ICA Mecca, but it's got shifted through so many directors, it's hard to know what the ICA Mecca, how the ICA functions in all this. But I have to tell you something about very exciting that I've been working on. Next to City Hall, there is the Masonic Temple on Congress Street. The first floor has like a Red Claws shop, but the rest of the building it has some nets on it so the limestone doesn't fall off and all this kind of stuff. Well, the Masonic Temple has created a Masonic Temple Foundation, and one of the programs proposed for the Masons Temple is something called Masons Block, and it could potentially be a project if the safety and security issues of the building can be brought up to code. And the fire department is completely behind it. And I'm sitting on a chair at the board for the Masons Block or the Masons Foundation, and that building could actually have a cultural program in it that does not adapt the space into white cubes for the traditional presentation of visual artworks in the model of the Universal Museum or the modern white cube, but to invite artists in to make work or to make installations or projects in these exquisite rooms. They're quite ruined now. I mean, it's never leaked in the building, but the building itself has these just exquisite spaces. There's a 2,000 square foot theater on 2 floors of it, even the Scottish Rites Theater. But the building sits in Portland, and it is just one of the most exciting and dynamic buildings ever. But it's been in the property of the Masons since it was built in 1908. There's some problems. The architect is Franklin Thompson, the same architect who designed the gateways to the Deering Oaks Park, which incidentally is a memorial to the end of the King Philip Indian Wars. Yeah, designed by Olmsted. That park is a memorial. He also designed a cemetery, the what's it called out there? Not Green Lawn, Evergreen. The Evergreen Cemetery out on Stevens Avenue. He designed that. So the architect is a treasure to Portland, but the genesis of the artistic project, Masons Block, has to be in step with the conservation of the building. It has to be in step with the Masons' mission, which, in the history of the Masons, is an organization of builders and contractors and stonemasons and craftspeople who, being a Mason, makes it possible for you to build a building without interference from, guess what, just like the Venice Biennale, from the government or the church. it's been an organization that's been there for so long that part of its structure is this sort of like this liberation from those kind of influences. So it's one of the reasons great buildings are built, because there's nobody interfering with it. You know, it's an incredible organization, and that building is huge, just huge, 6 stories plus. It's just an incredible thing. And if this can work, it would be sort of extraordinary to bring a contemporary program into Maine like that, where it would function almost like a port, you know, almost like Venice operated, and that new ideas could be, you know, shipped in. There could be an international exhibition of exchange in the building itself, as if the building were some kind of a port. Ideas could come. That's what we are thinking there. There's also the Mayo Street Arts, which I think is really great. That's in a decommissioned church, right, up on Munjoy Hill, which I always call Potrero Hill because I still have San Francisco in my head. What else do we have? And when you think about these places, after what we've been discussing in terms of the origin of arts organizations that stem from really groundbreaking artistic ideas back in the early part of the century. Now that we're in this century, of course, we have the internet. We have data transforming into works of art at a rapid pace. What are we missing? That's the question, and that's when the lights are going to come on, and that's what we're going to talk about. But I want to show you one wonderful thing. The 2 artists that we didn't talk about, looking at that history of media installations a couple weeks ago, were artists that emigrated to America during the Fluxus movement. Stena Vasulka from Iceland, Woody Vasulka from Brno, Czechoslovakia. They came to New York. Stena Vasulka was an electronic musician. Woody was a filmmaker. They came to New York and instantly started a collective where artists could borrow from one another, could borrow from the collective technical machinery for the making of artworks. And that grew into something that became later the Kitchen Center for Art, Music, and Video. Basically, the Kitchen started on Mercer Street in an abandoned kitchen of a hotel where the Vasulkas had been running this media exchange program. But the Vasulkas left New York and they moved to New Mexico. They moved to New Mexico for the primary reason of being close to the dump at Los Alamos. And they went to the auctions, they went to the dump, they found all of this first world technology in the making of weapons and scientific research, just available, just there. And so they started to make visionary and beautiful electronic works of art, and they have a very rich history of doing so. And this is a work called Warp by Stena Vasulka. And I know I've been talking a lot about getting out of the box, but here's a piece I think you might really enjoy by Stena. Sorry. In their history of making work, they always enjoyed mixing the 2 sense perceptors of video. They enjoyed mixing them up. In other words, they enjoyed making visual images through the sound channel and sound through the visual channel. And this is one that Stena is just, I think, moving, but her image is being animated in physically impossible ways by the signal coming in through the digital program. I just think that's really great. Is that an expression of our physical selves in this era? Well, geez, you know, you can find anything. You can find anything on this machine. Here's another Steiner piece. Looks like it's a projection. But they support themselves now teaching residencies at the different technological universities in Europe. I don't know what it is. All I can tell you is that it was on YouTube. But it's another Steiner piece. Oh, stop. Okay, there. Let me take it down. Let me close things down. And let me ask you, stop. All right. There. It's now asleep. Can we have the lights? Thank you. Thank you. So what do you, as I've been to some of your classes, I've seen the directions that you're working. What do we need? What kind of an organization do you need? In your dreams, what kind of an organization would you create? I mean, you can't, if I go to the Portland Museum and I start to suffocate a little bit. If it wasn't for that statue of Grant downstairs, I don't know if I would love the museum so much. But you know, that statue was refused by the White House as a commemoration of President Grant because it's too resolved and too peaceful and too meditative, and it's not forceful and militaristic and violent enough. That's not the memory of Grant that the United States wants to keep as a representational form in the White House. They want another memory. There, yes, there's some government control of artistic content. But it sits, did you know that? It sits down that beautiful white statue of Grant, where he's very reflective. His sword is not drawn, but it's behind him. It's a lovely sculpture made by an artist that was living in Maine at the time. But they refused it, but it's in the museum collection now. So what do we need?
Bob, I think we could talk about feminism. If you're talking about legs of stools, I think you have to bring that in, you know. I mean, and also the connection with Dada and Fluxus, you know, Sean Cage is almost like a a bumpy, knobby leg, but feminism has to be another leg.
Yes, I think you're right. I think you're right, yes.
And how museums in all sorts of ways have incorporated looking at the representation of the other. You know.
Because I am not a woman, I readily have included women in work. I've never thought of this division of people by being female or male-bodied. You know, I've always thought of the mind and the imagination and putting projects together. So, see, it's a funny thing about that is that my programs have always been inclusive, but
Yeah, but there's so much more than just the inclusion of a woman or not. It's the whole body, the whole opening up of cultural assumptions that we have to the body. Schneemann introducing herself in installations, whether it's that kitchen communal place where the women live and work. That's in California. I can't remember the name. Really, really early on. The Gorilla Girls.
Lace LA Contemporary Exhibitions.
Before that, one of the first earliest kind of feminist houses for living and making art, kitchen and work. the Guerrilla Girls, I mean, just the whole breaking open the museum and just who runs the museums, you know, all of that. I think you have to bring that in.
Good point. Yes, it's a
I
great,
really do.
it's a very great question.
And then on to other representation of the other question, the whole racial and other types of discrimination that, you know,
It
we
was
have
a
in our
huge,
white
it was a huge step made by Marcia Tucker when she was feeling pressure for her curatorial decisions at the Whitney Museum, not so much from her colleagues but from the board, and that Marcia Tucker heroically left her job as a curator at the Whitney Museum, which again is one of your interpreting, you know, of canonizing, you know, compressing artistic work into a museum designated sort of hierarchy. And she started the new museum, in New York, did incredible shows at the new museum when it was part of the New School of Social Research. It was down on the first floor of that, and then the building they now have on Broadway is their first. And it picks up, you know, it picks up the tradition of reportage, the new museum program now. It's over in the Bowery. It's a little bit carnival-like, but it sustains that principle about, like, this is a space for experimentation. This is a place that artists tell us what is to be done. Artists create the exhibitions. But the first 10 years of the new museum were just extraordinary, truly. The first thematic show they put together at the new museum that Marcia Tucker and her curators put together, I think, was Bad Painting. Right?
Bad Painting Show.
Bad Painting Show, which was an exhibition of artists that were breaking all of the established rule of paint and brush and making just magnificent pictures with finger painting and with all methods of mechanically reproduced forms and things. It was just an astonishing thing. Yeah, Neil Jenny, if you know Neil Jenny, kind of a comedic painter, was in that show. I think that was the first time people actually saw his finger painting. That had the title finger painted right into the bottom of it. Saw and sawed, saw on a log. Oh, just pretty great things. But Carolyn, you know, you're right. You're right. I feel what? The gendered question is opened up to all new frontiers now, of course. You know, so when I say a female-bodied person, I mean, I don't mean that lightly. I mean that really very seriously. You know, that the question of gender and sexual associations are just why.
And I don't think that Fluxus really dealt with that. There's almost like a juvenile kind of sense of fun, zen also, but they got pretty uncomfortable when you had like the Japanese woman, Zuboka, with painting,
Shigeko Kubota,
paintbrush,
vagina
with
painting.
vagina. Yeah, they
Right.
really got uncomfortable with social issues, and even the very strong, excellent artists like Alison Knowles and Yoko Ono, I think they weren't the directors. I mean, the he was like a misogynist.
Well, when you have a democratic organization like that, it's actually hard to pick a leadership person. But Matunius it's true, he was a bit misogynist. He did not care for Carol E. Schneemann. It's like she's like the one official, unofficial Fluxus artist. She was just like not all that much involved. But part of her practice came out of the transgressive pieces that were done, of course, and the scores and the scripts. And
It's true.
they were, it's
Perhaps carried it further, her and others.
Her and others.
Yeah, that form postmodernism. The performativity and the feminism, I think, are the hallmarks of postmodernism. We have a number of little stools and tables and tripods.
Oh yeah, you can. We got a little into it now. So what you're saying is that what Maine needs is an organization that's more fairly representative of artistic practice that comes out of the gendered or the sex communities?
No, I'm just pointing to the historical monumentality of it. I think it's an interesting question, what organization is. Just to question what that means, organization, because then it's who. Just what does that mean? Is it a academic affiliation or a?
It's huge.
Yes,
Well, you have
it's
an
huge.
academic affiliation. You run a gallery program with an academic affiliation.
Yeah.
It's true. And you know, everything from the Society NME, Catherine Dreiser, who was a practicing artist in that group, she gave all their papers to Yale, not the Museum of Modern Art, because she realized what the Museum of Modern Art that grew out of them was actually attempting to do in terms of canonizing the art movements and evaluation system based in mostly male produced and generated art. So she stepped away and she gave everything to Yale. So if you want to see anything of this society, that's the place to see it. Part of it is in the Beneke Rare Books collection, and the other part of it is at the Male Museum of Art, at the Yale Museum of Art.
We really, the interest too is just systems, I feel very much entrenched in the system here. I'm just talking about marketplace that we have to do all our finances on. I don't think, the demise of the public university is something, one can talk about. How art fits into that is a whole topic.
Oh, it's difficult. And now I have to tell you about how I had to break out of a museum. I promised. I don't know, it was back around 1990, I guess, 1990 something or other. Anyway, I was a curator at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and I didn't know when I went there in 1986 that 4 years down the road would be making a $90 million building, leaving where the building was, which was in Civic Center, where coming to sort of look at your contemporary art practice was part of just your civic responsibility. You'd be in Civic Center, you go to the museum, and you take the museum like a city block, which is kind of why I actually love this Mason's block concept. But the building had been built, the new building had been built, and we were in meetings and committees and all this work as a curatorial team, making the galleries, making the building work, designing a building. From just the front in all the way up through the design of the galleries. Well, there was one spring I was there, and I believe it was in April, and we were trying to decide where, in what galleries were best suited to a checklist for an exhibition that we wanted to open up with, which was called, again, this question of how does data translate into artworks. The show was called Public Information, Desire, Disaster, Document. It was sort of a history in the 20th century of artists that were working in image generation processes, but they were coming to the conclusion that it wasn't a very happy world. And the artists in it were Katie Nolan, Jeff Wall, there were a number of really great artists, but we had to figure out how the allotment was going to go. Once we decided that the ceilings needed to be 18 feet in 30-foot gallery matrices and things like this, well, technically I had to figure out how all these artists were going to work together. So I went to the building, went up to the 4th floor. It was still pretty much a concrete shell. If you've ever been there, you know it's made of this beautiful maple wood. Most of it is maple, and it's Nordic ice maple. We got a really, really, really great deal on the wood because it was harvested during the Chernobyl incident. But that's why the wood it's beautiful. So it's a little radioactive, but it's really beautiful. And the wood had been delivered, and it was just in these huge cleats. And so I was upstairs with the floor plan, and I was making notes about how things were going to go. And then I realized that it was very quiet. There's nobody there all of a sudden. The workmen were being very quiet. And I forgot that it was daylight savings, that the clocks had actually moved, and that they locked me in other words. They were gone. the whole it was just shut, it was totally shut down. I thought it was still, of course, the middle of the afternoon, but it was late in the day. So there I was, and I had gone through, just a few days before, we had gone through the design of the doorways and the public access safety features of the building. And there was this door that was under discussion that was way in the back of the theater that had been keyed incorrectly. You could still get out of it. But because the contractors long ago had made an accident, I thought my heart's beating like this. It's like, I'm not going to stay in here with these rats and this radioactive wood. I have to get out of here. And so I remembered from going over the floor plans that there was this one problem way down at the bottom by the loading docks, by the back, by the edge of the theater, by all this like thing. So it was dark, of course, at this point. So I'm following my way out, and voila! Because of this one issue under discussion, it hadn't been fixed, and I got out. And I climbed over a chain link fence and everything. But of course, I was only, what, 42 then or something. Yes, I got out. I broke out of the museum. And then I had had a terrible reputation in the museum when new administrators came in. And I actually had to always alter the physical space of the building for the integrity of an artwork that needed darkness or needed an entry to it around the corner. So I was always in direct, what's the word, like argument with the location of the exit signs and all this, because I had to move everything around. So I used to start moving the exit signs around, just for kicks, because you know you had to, right? You had to. And so the administrative director of the place, who was new, started to fight with me all the time. And I said, the art, you can't have that in the artwork. You have to make these architectural adaptations in order to suit the artwork. Otherwise, why show the art? You know, it's terrible. You're going to wreck it if there's an exit sign in the middle of the projection screen. Our visitors need to be safe and secure. So when I left the museum, actually, she said, and I quote, finally, she said, no more violations of our safety and security system. I said, well, thank you very much. I can hardly wait till the 80s. But I think they've gotten over that somewhat. But it's deeply ironic that I actually got out of the building through a safety and security system error. And there I was.
And we're very glad you did.
That's actually where my whole career starts. I start working with artists that are moving from the sculptor's three-dimensional ground into four-dimensional space with projections and light. And so it seemed that I had this ability to work for artists and go to museums around the country and in Europe and teach and sort of instruct them on the revisions that had to be made to the gallery spaces so that these artists could show their work. And it just always worked out. But who knew, that my good fortune would ultimately turn into my curse. You do that. So yes, I broke out of the museum. So I know you're all thinking, I can feel it. When you give a talk, you can really feel when the audience is you're either thinking that you have to get to your next class, or you're actually, like Carolyn, you're right, thank you. I'm really glad you brought that up. Because what do we need?